Welcome to the History and Heritage Podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time. Welcome to the History and Heritage Podcast's series on the Russian Revolution. This is episode 4, the July Days and the Kornilov Affair. In our last episode, we examined the period of dual power, where the Provisional Government struggled to maintain authority while facing growing challenges from the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolsheviks. Our story begins this time in July 1917, a time of heightened tensions in Petrograd. On July 3rd, in the old-style calendar, soldiers from the 1st Machine Gun Regiment initiated spontaneous demonstration. Frustrated with orders to deploy to the front lines amid worsening conditions, they refused their commander's orders and took to the streets. These soldiers were soon joined by factory workers and sailors from Kronstadt Naval Base, an explosive mix of discontented groups united by their shared demands for an end to the war and a transfer of power to the Soviets. What followed became known as the July Days, a period of intense unrest lasting from just July 3rd to July 5th in the old-style calendar. Tens of thousands of armed workers, soldiers and sailors marched through Petrograd, demanding all power to the Soviets. The scale of these demonstrations was unprecedented. Eyewitnesses described seas of people flooding the streets, their angry chants echoing off buildings. Red flags and banners with revolutionary slogans were everywhere. The air was thick with tension and the possibility of violence. The Bolshevik leadership was initially caught off guard by these spontaneous demonstrations. Lenin and other top leaders were hesitant to support what they saw as a premature uprising. They feared that their party wasn't yet strong enough to seize power successfully. Lenin, in particular, was in a difficult position. He had been arguing for months that the time wasn't yet right for a socialist revolution. He believed that the Bolsheviks needed to gain a majority support within key Soviets before attempting to seize power. However, he also recognized the danger of alienating the party's growing base of supporters if they didn't participate in the demonstrations. Lenin Trotsky played a more active role during these days. A gifted orator who had recently joined the Bolsheviks after years as an independent revolutionary figure, Trotsky addressed crowds across Petrograd during this volatile period. His speeches sought both to channel their energy while urging restraint. Trotsky's oratory skills were put to the test as he addressed massive crowds from balconies and improvised platforms. He had to shout to be heard over the din of the crowd, his words carried back through the masses by those closest to him. His ability to connect with demonstrators while also tempering their more radical impulses was crucial during these tense days. On July 4th, tensions reached their peak as protesters marched on key government buildings such as Tauride Palace, the headquarters of both the Provisional Government and Petrograd Soviet at different times. Protesters demanded the Soviet leaders assume full control over governance immediately. The scene at Tauride Palace was chaotic. Thousands of demonstrators surrounded the buildings, their angry shouts drowning out attempts by Soviet leaders to address the crowd. Inside, debates raged among Soviet deputies about how to respond to the crisis unfolding outside their doors. However, Menshevik and socialist revolutionary leaders within the Soviet refused these demands outright. They argued Russia wasn't ready for socialism yet, instead advocating continued cooperation with Alexander Kerensky's Provisional Government, a decision deeply unpopular among demonstrators. This refusal marked a significant split between the moderate socialists and the more radical elements of the revolutionary movement. It highlighted the growing ideological divide that would shape Russian politics in the coming months. Clashes erupted between protesters and forces loyal to Kerensky's government through Petrograd streets over these 3 days. Gunfire rang out sporadically, while barricades sprang up across neighbourhoods like Vyborg district, where worker militias held sway temporarily. The violence was not limited to street fighting. There were reports of snipers firing from rooftops, adding to the atmosphere of fear and chaos. In some areas, soldiers and workers engaged in pitched battles with government forces, using whatever weapons they could find. By the 5th of July, Kerensky's government regained control over Petrograd through brutal crackdowns involving loyalist troops supported by Cossack detachments brought in to urban areas specifically for crowd suppression purposes. The government's response was both swift and harsh. Cossack cavalry charged into crowds, swinging their sabres and trampling protesters underfoot. Machine guns were set up at key intersections, their rattling fire causing panic and dispersing large groups of demonstrators. Hundreds were killed or wounded during this violent suppression effort, marking an end to the July Days uprising. Despite this setback, the Bolsheviks maintained a strong grassroots support base, especially within urban industrial centres where working-class militancy remained high. The aftermath of the July Days saw a temporary setback for the Bolsheviks. The Provisional Government blamed them for instigating the violence, despite their initial hesitation to support the demonstrations. Key Bolshevik leaders, including Trotsky, were arrested. Lenin, fearing arrest, fled into hiding in Finland. Lenin's flight to Finland was a dramatic affair. Disguised as a Finnish worker with a wig and without his trademark beard, he was smuggled across the border by loyal supporters. From his hiding place, he continued to direct Bolshevik activities through a stream of letters and articles. The Bolsheviks' party offices were raided, and their newspapers were shut down. However, this oppression only served to further radicalize many workers and soldiers who saw it as proof that peaceful change was impossible under the current government. Throughout these events, the socialist revolutionaries played a significant role in opposing Bolshevik demands for immediate Soviet power. The SRs aligned with more moderate factions but found themselves increasingly at odds with both radicals like Lenin's followers and their own peasant supporters who demanded land reform urgently. The SR's position was particularly difficult. As the party with the strongest support among the peasantry, they were under immense pressure to deliver on the promises of land reform. However, their leadership's common commitment to work within the existing political system put them at odds with the more radical elements of their base. Just weeks after suppressing the July Days uprising came another crisis, the Kornilov Affair, an attempted coup led by Lev Kornilov, aimed at establishing military dictatorship amidst perceived chaos. Kornilov was a career military officer who had risen through the ranks to become one of Russia's most prominent generals. He was deeply concerned about the breakdown of discipline in the army and the growing influence of soldier committees, which he saw as undermining Russia's war effort. Kornilov's background is worth exploring. Born to a Cossack family, he had distinguished himself in the Russo-Japanese War in World War I. He was known for his conservative views and strong belief in military discipline. Many in the officer corps saw him as a potential savior who could restore order to the increasingly chaotic situation in Russia. In late August 1917, Kornilov attempted a military coup to establish a dictatorship. He believed that only strong authoritarian rule could prevent Russia from descending into chaos and defeat in the war. Kornilov ordered troops to march on Petrograd with plans to overthrow Kerensky's government. The lead-up to Kornilov's coup attempt was marked by increasing tension between the military high command and the Provisional Government. Kornilov and his supporters believed that Kerensky was too weak to stand up to the Bolsheviks and other radical elements. They saw military intervention as the only way to save Russia from what they perceived as an impending disaster. Alexander Kerensky, now head of the Provisional Government, panicked when he learned of Kornilov's plans. Fearing both Kornilov's coup and the growing Bolshevik influence among workers and soldiers, Kerensky made a fateful decision. He turned to the revolutionary forces for help in defending Petrograd. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in Russia. Kerensky's call for help allowed the Bolsheviks, who had been suppressed just weeks earlier, to re-emerge as a powerful force in Petrograd politics. The Bolsheviks played a pivotal role in organizing resistance against Kornilov. Leon Trotsky, recently released from prison, led efforts through the Petrograd Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee. They mobilized Red Guards, which were armed workers' militias, and coordinated with railway workers to disrupt Kornilov's troop movements. Trotsky's leadership during this crisis was crucial. Despite having been imprisoned by Kerensky's government just weeks earlier, he threw himself into organizing the defense of Petrograd. His ability to rally workers and soldiers, combined with his strategic acumen, proved invaluable in coordinating resistance to Kornilov. Bolshevik agitators were sent to meet Kornilov's advancing troops. Through persuasion and propaganda, they managed to convince many soldiers to abandon support for the coup. They argued that Kornilov was a counter-revolutionary threat to the gains made since the February Revolution. These agitators employed a variety of tactics. They distributed leaflets explaining the situation from a revolutionary perspective, organized impromptu meetings with soldiers, and in some cases appealed directly to troops' desire for peace and land reform, promises that Kornilov's coup threatened to undo. Meanwhile, railway workers played a crucial part in thwarting Kornilov's advance. They sabotaged tracks, redirected trains, and refused to transport troops, effectively paralysing the general's forces before they could reach Petrograd. The railways workers' actions were a masterclass in creative resistance. In some cases, they sent Kornilov's trains in circles or to wrong destinations. In others, they dismantled sections of track or removed critical components from locomotives. Their efforts significantly slowed Kornilov's advance and brought crucial time for the defenders in Petrograd. The coup collapsed without significant bloodshed, as Kornilov's demoralized troops refused to advance on the capital. This failure marked a significant shift in power dynamics within Russia. The Bolsheviks, who had been on the defensive since the July days, now emerged as key defenders of the revolution against counter-revolutionary threats. The aftermath of the Kornilov Affair had profound implications for Russian politics. It further discredited Kerensky and exposed deep divisions within both the military leadership and political factions supporting the Provisional Government. Kerensky's decision to arm workers and release Bolshevik prisoners to defend against Kornilov backfired spectacularly. It gave the Bolsheviks access to weapons and allowed them to portray themselves as the true defenders of the revolution. Their popularity soared among workers and soldiers. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers. Kerensky, in his desperation to save his government from a right-wing coup, had empowered the very left-wing forces he had been trying to suppress. This decision would come back to haunt him in the coming months. By September 1917, the Bolsheviks had gained control of key institutions like factory committees and even secured majorities within Soviets across Russia, including the crucial Petrograd Soviet itself. This newfound influence positioned them for their eventual seizure of power in October. The Bolsheviks capitalized on their success during the Kornilov Affair by establishing formal structures like military revolutionary committees. These committees, initially formed to coordinate defense against Kornilov, would prove instrumental during the October Revolution. The military revolutionary committees served as a bridge between the Bolshevik Party and the broader revolutionary movement, allowing for coordinated action across different sectors of society. By organizing through these committees, Bolsheviks were able to mobilize support from both soldiers and workers, creating a powerful force that could challenge the Provisional Government directly. These committees became de facto centres of power in many areas, often superseding the authority of the Provisional Government's local representatives. They controlled arms distribution, coordinated defence efforts, and in some cases took over administration of key industries and services. The July Days and Kornilov Affair were pivotal moments in 1917 that exposed the fragility of the Provisional Government and set the stage for the Bolsheviks' rise to power. These events demonstrated the volatility of Russia's political situation and the speed with which fortunes could change. The Bolsheviks went from being suppressed after the July Days to emerging as heroes in the Kornilov Affair. Meanwhile, the failures of both the Provisional Government and the conservative military leaders created a power vacuum that the Bolsheviks were increasingly well positioned to fill. In our next episode, we'll explore how these events led directly to the October Revolution, examining how Lenin and Trotsky orchestrated the Bolshevik seizure of power and established a regime that would shape global politics for decades to come.